Well, let's get to the subject today. We're talking about presuppositionalism. So lay out what that view is and maybe some of the competing views, and then from there we'll look at arguments against
it. Within evangelicalism, I think the two basic or major camps of how we do apologetics are divided into what I sometimes call the classical approach, or some people might call it an evidential approach on the one hand, and then the presuppositionalism on the other. And there's a range within each one.
Okay. Where would Reformed epistemology fall in there?
Well, actually, Reformed epistemology would be a third category. I only left it out because it's not as prominent among evangelicals as it might be within a more broad spectrum of Christianity.
Okay.
And it's generally held by people with a little bit more of a philosophical orientation. So it would be the approach of, say, Alvin Plantinga, taking his philosophy of proper basicality and warrant and these things and applying that to the task of apologetics. So it's kind of a different animal than either presuppositionalism or the classical approach.
So tell me more about those two approaches then, the two main approaches.
So in effect, Cornelius Van Til, who's the fountainhead of American presuppositional thought, who was a professor at Westminster Seminary in the early 20th century, in effect says that any argument for the existence of God that concludes God cannot be the God of Christianity, because the God of Christianity, in his estimation, has to be the presupposition of all argument. So in effect, Van Til would say the assumption or the presupposition of God is the necessary condition for all knowledge. Whereas the classical approach is going to say there are truths about reality that normal human beings with the faculties God has created us with, there are truths that we cannot fail to know as human beings. Mm-hmm. And from those truths, a person can construct, we believe, a demonstrable argument for the existence of God. So it's just basically a debate, if you will, over the propriety of giving arguments and evidence primarily for God's existence.
So are you familiar with Cy Ten Bruggencate?
Only in as much as I've seen some of his stuff on the internet. I don't know that I've had a steady diet of his way in which he does it.
It's an interesting way to put it.
Well, that's just to say that I don't know, in my opinion, whether I would categorize him as, he's spot on with the Van Til Bonson approach, or if he's got his own sort of take on it.
That's actually the distinction I was trying to make there, is like his version of presuppositionalism is a lot different than I think what you described.
Okay. Well, that may very well be. So I'll defer to your knowledge about that. He's just.
I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about him either. So.
So I've heard his name. I've seen him a few times in just partial exchanges, but never really watched an entire debate. So you've inspired me maybe to go back, because I would be curious as to how faithful he is. I take the presuppositional method to be best exemplified by Greg Bonson, as a disciple of Van Til.
I think he did a lot of debates and everything.
Oh, absolutely. He's debating.
And everyone says that he's like just completely destroyed these guys, the people he's debating. And that's actually one of the things that people say that why presuppositionalism is the best method, is because it's so effective.
Well, what's interesting about that observation, I would allege, is that whenever the presuppositionalist actually starts to construct an argument, I've never seen them fail to do exactly what the classical method does.
So expound on
what
that.
They do, basically, this is what I think is a perennial mistake in all that I've read of all the presuppositionalists that I've read, including Bonson's material, is that when they define presuppositionalism, they say it this way: the assumption of God is the precondition of knowledge. But when they try to explain what that means, what they end up defending is God is the precondition of knowledge. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, God is the precondition of knowledge because He's the creator, right?
Yeah.
But God is not the same as the assumption of God. Now, what's interesting is this particular nuanced point came out in Bonson's debate with R.C. Sproul in the late 70s. And when Sproul was trying to rehearse back to Bonson how he understood Bonson's position, it's just an audio, so you're having to visualize. You could almost see Bonson shaking his head because Sproul kind of trails off. Oh, that's not what you mean? And here's what the issue was. Bonson said, no, we're not merely making an ontological point. We're not merely saying God is the precondition of knowledge. And Bonson goes on, because that doesn't distinguish the two models. Both the classical, and I think he's right, both the classical approach and the presuppositional approach would agree that God is the precondition of knowledge because He's the creator. What makes the presuppositionalist distinct from the classical is the epistemological question of the assumption of God is the precondition of knowledge. In every place I've ever read any presuppositionalist trying to explain that, he always ends up explaining how God is the precondition. In fact, it's interesting, just before our conversation, I was just having a conversation with a gentleman in the lobby where we are, and he is a presuppositionalist. And I pulled out a Van Til quote on one of my slides of one of my PowerPoints, and within one paragraph, he switches from the presupposition of the truth of Christianity is the precondition of knowledge to the truth of Christianity is the precondition of knowledge. Well, the latter I wouldn't disagree with. That's exactly what the classical model would affirm. God obviously is a precondition.
I like that distinction between the ontological kind of thing and then the epistemological.
Hello, Cameron here. Thanks for watching this little clip. If you want more, there's actually a whole interview this clip came from. Just click the link on the screen. Oh, and by the way, we post 2 to 3 new videos a week. So if you're interested in apologetics at all, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you can catch our latest content. And then lastly, remember that Christianity is true.